Welcome, dear listeners. As the night settles in and the world around you grows quiet, let yourself drift into a peaceful, relaxing space. Allow the soft glow of the moon to fill your thoughts as we journey to a small village nestled between rolling hills and an ancient forest. It is a place of simple lives, where the days are filled with laughter and warmth, and the nights are calm. But tonight, something unusual stirs in the shadows, something waiting to be discovered. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the story of the witch and the dancing shadows begin, as we gently slip into a world of mystery and wonder. Once upon a time, in a quiet village nestled between rolling hills and a dense ancient forest, the people lived simple lives. Their days were filled with the hum of daily chores, the laughter of children, and the warmth of hearth fires that glowed deep into the night. The villagers prided themselves on the harmony they shared with their surroundings, never suspecting that something strange was about to cast a shadow over their peaceful lives. It began on a night when the moon hung low in the sky, full and bright, casting silver beams across the cobbled streets and thatched rooftops. The villagers, as they always did, closed their shutters and drifted to sleep, unaware of the subtle change creeping through their village. But the shadows, they knew. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker. A shadow detached itself from the oak tree in the village square, slipping silently across the ground as if testing its newfound freedom. Then another shadow followed, this one from the stone well, moving with slow, deliberate grace. By midnight, dozens of shadows had escaped their owners, weaving and writhing in the moonlight like dancers performing a secret ritual. The first to notice was a young boy named Aric. He was a curious soul, often staying up late to gaze at the stars and dream of adventures far beyond the village's borders. That night, however, his dreams were interrupted by a strange sound. A faint rustling, like the wind brushing through dry leaves, though the night was still. He crept to his window, peeking out from behind the curtains, and what he saw sent a shiver down his spine. In the square, where shadows should have been still and silent, they were moving, dancing. Aric rubbed his eyes, certain that sleep had clouded his vision. But no matter how hard he blinked, the shadows remained in motion. They swirled and twirled, stretching long and thin, then collapsing into dark pools before rising again in eerie shapes. "What in the world?" Aric whispered, his breath catching in his throat. His first instinct was to run to his parents, to tell them of the strange sight in the square. But something held him back. A small voice inside warned him that this was no ordinary trick of the light. The shadows did not behave like mere darkness. They moved with purpose, with intent. The next morning, the village woke to find things out of place. Lanterns were tipped over, tools were scattered, and strange markings, like the impressions of footprints, appeared in places no one had walked. The villagers were puzzled but not yet alarmed. They blamed the wind or wild animals, brushing off the strange occurrences as coincidence. But Aric knew better. He had seen the shadows with his own eyes. And while the others dismissed the strange happenings, Aric could not shake the feeling that something unnatural was at work. Every night after that, he would stay up late, watching from his window. Every night, the shadows grew bolder, their dances more elaborate, their movements more sinister. One evening, as the village prepared for bed, Aric overheard a conversation between his grandmother and his father. His grandmother, old and wise, spoke in hushed tones, her voice carrying the weight of forgotten stories. "There are old tales," she said, her voice low, "of a witch who once lived in these woods. They say she had the power to bend light and shadow to her will, casting spells that could make the very night dance. But that was long ago. No one's seen or heard of her in many years." Aric's heart quickened. A witch? Could she be the one behind the strange events? His mind raced with possibilities, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in the village, it wasn't going to stop on its own. That night, as the shadows once again took to their eerie dance in the moonlight, Aric made up his mind. He would not be content to watch from the safety of his window any longer. He had to know the truth. And so, with a heart full of determination and a spark of courage, Aric set out to uncover the mystery of the dancing shadows. Little did he know that his journey would lead him far beyond the village square, into the heart of the forest, where the line between light and shadow blurred, and an ancient power waited to be discovered. The days that followed brought no peace to the village. Each morning, the villagers woke to more unsettling signs that something was terribly wrong. Pails of water had spilled. Brooms left resting against walls had vanished, and freshly baked loaves of bread were found scattered across the square, as if some unseen hand had thrown them in a fit of mischief. Though they laughed nervously at first, the fear in the village grew with each passing day. But at night, Aric saw what the others could not. The shadows were no longer content to hide in the corners of the village. They had become bold, creeping closer to the homes, slipping under doors and slinking up walls. Aric, who now spent each evening peering from his window, watched as they performed their strange dance. And though the movements of the shadows were graceful, there was something menacing in the way they stretched and curled, as though mocking the very light that cast them. One afternoon, as Aric fetched water from the well, he overheard the village blacksmith grumbling to the baker. "Something unnatural is at work here," the blacksmith muttered, his face twisted in worry. "Tools don't just vanish into thin air, and shadows don't move unless someone's making them." The baker, a stout man with flour always clinging to his clothes, nodded gravely. Aye, and last night I could have sworn I saw a shadow move where it shouldn't have. Not a soul in sight. Yet there it was, slinking by my shop. Aric's heart raced as he listened. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. Others were beginning to suspect that the village was no longer safe, that some hidden force was at work. But no one spoke aloud of magic or curses. Such things belonged to old stories, not to a village so far from danger. Yet in the quiet corners of their minds, the villagers began to whisper of darker possibilities. That evening, Aric's grandmother told him another tale. As they sat by the fire, she recounted the legend of the witch of the forest. They say she was once a healer, his grandmother began, her eyes fixed on the crackling flames. A woman with the gift of herbs and the knowledge of the forest. But something changed her. Some say it was grief, others say it was anger. Whatever it was, she turned her back on the village and fled into the woods, never to be seen again. Aric leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. Do you think she's still out there? His grandmother's eyes darkened with a flicker of worry. Who can say? But if she is, and if these strange happenings are her doing, we must be cautious. Magic, especially the kind that bends shadows to its will, is a dangerous thing. Aric felt a chill run down his spine. The idea of magic, real, living magic, was both thrilling and terrifying. He had always dreamed of adventure, but this was different. This was his village, his home, and the threat was no longer a distant fantasy. That night, as the village grew quiet and the moon rose high in the sky, Aric stood at his window once again. The shadows, as they had done every night, began to stir. They no longer resembled the harmless shapes cast by flickering lanterns. Now they seemed alive, each movement deliberate, as though guided by invisible hands. They swirled through the village square, winding through the streets in intricate patterns, faster and bolder than before. Aric's breath caught in his throat as he saw one shadow, larger than the rest, stretch upward from the well, reaching toward the sky before twisting into a form that almost resembled a person. It lingered there for a moment, swaying back and forth as if waiting for something or someone. Suddenly, Aric knew he could not wait any longer. The shadows were growing stronger, and the village was in danger. He had to find the witch, the one who could cast such spells, and put an end to the dancing shadows before they overtook the village entirely. Aric packed a small satchel with bread and water, slung it over his shoulder, and with a final glance at his sleeping parents, slipped out into the night. The cool air greeted him, and the village lay still beneath the glow of the full moon. But the shadows, they moved with purpose, gliding silently across the ground as if aware of his departure. With his heart pounding in his chest and his mind racing, Aric made his way to the edge of the forest, where the trees stood tall and dark, their branches weaving together like the bars of a cage. He took a deep breath, stepping into the shadows that awaited him, and began the journey toward the unknown. The witch, the dancing shadows, and the secret to stopping them. Whatever the truth was, Aric would find it in the heart of the forest. The forest loomed before Aric, dark and mysterious, its branches twisting like ancient hands reaching out to greet him. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Despite the cold weight of fear in his chest, Aric pressed forward, his footsteps soft against the mossy earth. Every crack of a twig and rustle of leaves made his heart race, but he knew he could not turn back. The fate of the village rested on his shoulders, and the witch held the answers he needed. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, as though they too were alive. Aric could feel them watching him, trailing at the edges of his vision. But when he turned to look, they slunk back into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. He tightened his grip on his satchel and whispered a silent prayer to the old gods, hoping they would guide him through the forest safely. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had a way of slipping through the cracks in the forest. Just when Aric began to wonder if he had lost his way, a strange light flickered ahead. It was not the silver glow of the moon, nor the warm light of a fire, but something else entirely. The light was cold, shimmering with an otherworldly hue, and it seemed to pulse with each beat of Aric's heart. As he approached, the light revealed itself to be a small clearing, encircled by towering oaks that stood as silent sentinels. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar, covered in vines and moss, with intricate symbols carved into its surface. And standing beside it, bathed in the strange light, was the witch. She was taller than Aric had imagined, with long dark hair that fell in waves down her back, and robes as black as midnight that flowed around her like the shadows themselves. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, oh her eyes, glowed with the same eerie light that filled the clearing. She did not look at Aric as he stepped into the clearing, but he knew she had sensed his presence the moment he entered the forest. "You've come far, little one," the witch said, her voice soft but sharp, like the crack of ice on a winter's day. She traced her fingers across the symbols on the stone, as if the act of speaking to him was of little consequence. "I've been expecting you." Aric swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. "Are you the one who brought the shadows to life? The one who's cursed the village?" The witch's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Brought them to life?" she mused. "No, boy. Shadows are already alive. They've always danced just beyond the reach of light. All I did was give them the freedom to move as they pleased." "Why?" Aric asked, his voice trembling. "Why would you do this to us? The village is terrified, and the shadows are growing stronger every night." The witch finally turned her gaze upon him, and Aric felt a chill run through his bones. Her eyes, so cold and ancient, seemed to see through him, as though she knew every thought and fear that passed through his mind. "Balance, boy," she said softly, but there was a weight to her words. The world is built on balance, light and shadow, life and death, truth and lies. For too long, your village has bathed itself in light, seeking to banish the darkness as if it were an enemy. But shadows are not to be feared. They are part of the natural order, just as day gives way to night. Aric felt a flicker of understanding, though fear still gripped him. But the shadows, they're causing harm. They're scaring the people, destroying our village. The witch tilted her head, studying him with a strange intensity. That is because the balance has been broken. The shadows are only doing what they have been denied for so long. If you wish to stop them, you must restore the balance. Aric's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of her words settled over him. How? How do I restore the balance? The witch turned back to the altar, her fingers tracing the symbols once more. That is for you to discover, young one, but I will give you this. Shadows are born where light is blind. Remember those words and they will guide you. Her cryptic answer left Aric with more questions than answers, but he knew better than to press her further. The witch's presence, though not openly hostile, was far from comforting, and he could sense that her patience had its limits. As Aric turned to leave the clearing, the witch's voice drifted toward him once more. You have until the next full moon. If you fail to restore the balance by then, the shadows will claim your village, and there will be no light left to save it. With those final words echoing in his mind, Aric stepped back into the forest, his thoughts racing. The witch had given him a clue, but the path ahead was still shrouded in mystery. The shadows were alive, and time was running out. But Aric knew one thing for certain: he would not give up. He would find a way to restore the balance, to save his village, no matter the cost. And so, with the weight of the witch's words heavy in his heart, Aric made his way back through the forest, the shadows now closer than ever before. The walk back to the village felt longer than Aric had remembered, the forest heavier, as if the very air clung to him like a thick cloak. The witch's words echoed in his mind. Shadows are born where light is blind. He turned the phrase over and over, trying to make sense of its meaning. But the more he thought, the more it slipped through his fingers, like grains of sand in a windstorm. By the time he reached the edge of the village, the moon had climbed high in the sky, casting long silver beams over the familiar rooftops. Yet the village felt different now, as though something had shifted in his absence. The shadows, once only lingering in the corners of his vision, seemed bolder, stretching out from beneath doorways and creeping across the cobbled streets like silent, dark creatures. They no longer hid. They no longer waited. Aric's heart pounded as he hurried to his house, slipping through the back door as quietly as he could. His parents were already asleep, their breathing steady and calm. The thought of waking them crossed his mind, but he knew there was little they could do. The shadows would not be fought with swords or fire. They needed something else, something only he could find. But what? As Aric lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the witch's riddle gnawed at him. Shadows are born where light is blind. What could it mean? Was there a place in the village where the light was somehow blind, where the shadows could take root and grow? Or was it something deeper, something he had yet to understand? Sleep eluded him, and his thoughts tumbled restlessly through the night. When morning came, the village was buzzing with fear. The shadows, which had once been a strange curiosity, had grown dangerous. Several villagers claimed to have seen dark figures darting through the streets, knocking over lanterns and stealing food. Others spoke of shadows that had loomed over their beds as they slept, their silent forms heavy with menace. By midday, the village square was filled with anxious whispers. Groups of villagers huddled together, discussing what to do about the strange occurrences. Aric overheard the village elders talking about gathering a hunting party to search the forest for the source of the darkness. "We need to drive it out," one elder said, his voice grim. "Whatever is causing this, we must find it and destroy it before it destroys us." Aric's stomach tightened at the thought. They had no idea what they were dealing with, no understanding of the magic that pulsed through the shadows. He wanted to tell them what he had learned, but who would believe him? A boy claiming to have spoken to a witch in the forest. They would dismiss him as a child with an overactive imagination. But then, an idea sparked in his mind. Something the witch had said, something important. The witch had spoken of balance. The shadows were not evil, not by nature. They had simply been unleashed in a way that broke the natural order. What if the solution wasn't to fight the shadows, but to restore the harmony between light and darkness? It was a strange thought, but one that filled Aric with a flicker of hope. That night, after the village settled into uneasy sleep, Aric made his way back to the edge of the forest. His feet carried him swiftly through the trees, his heart racing with purpose. The witch had given him a clue, and though it was a riddle, he knew that the answer lay within her words. He had to confront her again. This time, not just for answers, but for a solution. The forest was silent as Aric approached the clearing where he had met the witch. The strange light still shimmered there, casting ghostly shadows on the ancient stone altar. And there, standing as still as the trees around her, was the witch. "You return," she said without turning, her voice as cold and sharp as the night air. "And yet, I sense you are no closer to understanding." Aric stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I need more than riddles," he said, his voice firmer than he had expected. "The village is in danger, and I don't have time to solve puzzles. If you want me to restore the balance, you need to help me understand how." The witch turned slowly, her glowing eyes settling on him. "I have already given you the key, young one. The shadows are born where light is blind, but you must learn to see beyond the surface. The answer lies not in the destruction of the shadows, but in the light that casts them." Aric frowned, frustration bubbling in his chest. "But what does that mean? How do I stop them?" The witch stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "There is a place in your village, a place where the balance has been broken. Find it, and you will find your answer. But beware, light alone cannot defeat the shadows. Only by restoring what has been lost can you save your village." With those cryptic words, the witch vanished into the shadows, leaving Aric alone in the clearing, his mind spinning with more questions than ever. But one thing was clear. The answer lay somewhere in the village, hidden where the balance between light and darkness had been lost. He would have to find it, and soon. The next full moon was only days away. Time was running out. As the days slipped by, the tension in the village thickened like the mist that sometimes rolled in from the forest. The villagers grew restless, their eyes hollow with fear and sleepless nights. The shadows had grown bolder, no longer content to merely cause mischief. Now they stretched across the streets at dusk, their dark forms twisting and turning, slipping into homes and looming over sleeping villagers like silent predators. By the time Aric woke one morning to find that the village blacksmith had fled in the night, his forge abandoned, it was clear that panic was setting in. The people whispered of leaving the village behind, of finding safety elsewhere, away from the haunting shadows that seemed to have taken a life of their own. But Aric knew they could not run. The shadows would follow, or worse, consume what little light remained in the village if they did nothing. He had to act, but the witch's riddle still gnawed at him. Shadows are born where light is blind. The answer was just beyond his reach, like a shadow he couldn't quite grasp. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first flicker of torchlight filled the village square, Aric wandered through the streets, watching the shadows stretch and grow. The villagers had taken to lighting every lantern, every torch, even placing candles in windows, hoping that the bright glow would keep the darkness at bay. But it only seemed to make the shadows more menacing. They clung to the edges of the light, slinking in the spaces where the firelight flickered and faltered. As Aric stood in the square, he began to understand. The witch had spoken of balance, of the need to restore what had been broken. And as he watched the villagers desperately trying to chase away every scrap of darkness with harsh, burning flames, he realized that they had misunderstood. The light was not blinding the shadows. It was forcing them to grow stronger. Shadows are born where light is blind, Aric whispered to himself. Blind. Not in darkness, but in brightness. Too much light makes the shadows grow. The truth of it settled in his mind like a heavy stone. The village had been trying to banish the shadows with overwhelming light, but it was this imbalance, this blindness, that allowed the shadows to grow bolder. Aric's heart quickened. He had found the first piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough to simply understand. He had to act. He had to restore the balance, as the witch had said. But how? How could he make the villagers see that the very thing they were doing to protect themselves was making the shadows stronger? Just then, a crash echoed from the far end of the village, followed by terrified shouts. Aric spun toward the sound, his feet carrying him quickly through the winding streets. As he neared the commotion, he saw a group of villagers gathered around a small house, their faces pale with fear. The door had been thrown open, and inside, the shadows danced wildly, twisting and writhing like dark flames. "It's the shadows!" one of the villagers cried. "They're taking over!" Without thinking, Aric pushed through the crowd and stepped into the house. Inside, the air was cold, and the light from the lanterns cast eerie, trembling shapes on the walls. But Aric could see now. Too much light had left deep pockets of shadow, places where the darkness could fester and grow. The villagers had tried to chase the darkness away, but in doing so, they had only made the shadows angrier, more powerful. Aric turned to the villagers, who stood frozen in the doorway, fear etched on their faces. "Put out the lanterns," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What?" one of them stammered. "But the light. It's the only thing keeping them at bay." "No," Aric replied, shaking his head. "The light is what's making them stronger. We've been using too much. We need to soften the light to let the shadows find their place, not overwhelm them." The villagers looked at him in disbelief, but something in Aric's voice, something steady and sure, made them hesitate. Slowly, one by one, they extinguished the lanterns, leaving only a faint glow from a single candle in the corner of the room. At first, the shadows seemed to recoil, as though uncertain of this new balance. They slithered along the walls, twisting in strange, unfamiliar shapes. But as the light softened, so too did the shadows. They no longer loomed, no longer danced wildly. Instead, they settled into the corners where they belonged, quiet and still. The villagers gasped, watching in awe as the once threatening shadows melted into their natural places. Aric felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew this was only the beginning. The witch's riddle had begun to unravel, but the danger was far from over. The shadows would return with the next full moon, and unless the village found a way to restore the balance permanently, the darkness would come for them again. As Aric stepped out into the cool night air, he knew what he had to do. The balance between light and shadow had been disturbed, and only by understanding the deeper magic of the village could he hope to save it. Time was running out, but the answer was there, somewhere, waiting to be found. With renewed determination, Aric set his mind to solving the riddle once and for all. The next morning, the village buzzed with cautious hope. The events of the previous night had spread quickly. How Aric had stepped into the chaos of shadows and calmed them with nothing but a simple candle. Though the villagers didn't fully understand what had happened, they now looked to Aric as something of a beacon in the growing storm. But Aric knew better than to celebrate. He had merely delayed the shadows, not defeated them. Determined to unravel the mystery before the shadows returned in full force, Aric spent the day wandering through the village, studying every nook and cranny where shadows clung. The witch's words were clearer to him now. Shadows are born where light is blind. It was not just the village's fear of the dark that had summoned the shadows, but the village's need to dominate the darkness, to banish it completely. The delicate balance between light and shadow had been broken. Aric thought back to his childhood, to when the village had been simpler. The light from lanterns had been soft, and the shadows had always seemed gentle, resting peacefully at the edges of the night. Now, harsh torches blazed in every corner, their flames tall and bright, leaving no room for the natural ebb and flow of darkness. It was this imbalance that had allowed the shadows to grow wild. But how to restore the balance? That was the question. The witch had said it could be done, but she hadn't told him how. As Aric paced the narrow streets, deep in thought, his feet carried him toward the village church, a place he hadn't visited in many months. It stood at the edge of the village, its old stone walls draped in ivy, and its steeple casting a long shadow that stretched toward the forest. Inside, the church was cool and quiet, the air thick with the smell of old wood and candle wax. The soft glow of the stained glass windows filled the space with a warm, colourful light. Aric's gaze was drawn to the windows themselves, each one depicting a scene from the old legends of light and dark, of the eternal dance between day and night. He stood before one window in particular, a beautiful mosaic of a sun and moon, forever chasing each other in the sky. As he stared at the image, something clicked in his mind. The village had tried to separate the two forces, light and shadow, treating one as good and the other as evil. But this was wrong. They were meant to coexist, to dance together in harmony, just as the sun and moon did in the sky. The discovery sent a thrill through Aric's heart. The shadows were not something to be destroyed, but something to be understood, to be brought back into balance with the light. They weren't enemies. They were part of the natural order. Leaving the church, Aric's thoughts were racing. The witch had given him the key. and now he was beginning to understand. The shadows were not creatures of darkness alone, but creations of imbalance. The village had to embrace both light and shadow to let each have its place, or the shadows would continue to grow wild and dangerous. But understanding was only the first step. Aric had to find a way to put this knowledge into action. As he made his way back through the village, his eyes caught sight of the blacksmith's abandoned forge. It sat cold and empty, a place where shadows had once danced unchecked. Aric's mind flashed back to something his grandmother had once told him. Fire is the balance of light and shadow. Too much flame and it devours, too little and it fades away. The blacksmith's fire, always steady, always controlled, had once been a symbol of balance in the village. Could this be the answer? He hurried to the forge, his heart pounding with anticipation. The forge itself was dusty, long neglected since the blacksmith had fled. But the tools and bellows were still there, waiting to be used. Aric knew little of smithing, but he had watched the blacksmith enough to understand the basics. With steady hands, he began to stoke the fire, feeding it just enough to let it grow, but not so much that it burned too brightly. As the fire crackled to life, Aric watched the interplay of light and shadow in the forge. The shadows no longer danced wildly. They moved gently, swaying with the flicker of the flames, settling into their natural places. For the first time, Aric saw the balance restored, even if only in this small corner of the village. A smile crept across his face. This was it. The answer wasn't to fight the shadows, but to bring them back into harmony with the light. He would have to convince the rest of the village to do the same, to stop fighting the darkness, and instead find the balance that had been lost. As Aric left the forge, the sun setting behind him, he knew that the true test was yet to come. The next full moon would bring the shadows again, stronger than ever. But now he had hope. He had discovered the secret, how to restore balance. All that remained was to put his plan into motion. With the witch's words still echoing in his mind, Aric steeled himself for the challenge ahead. Time was running out, but for the first time, he felt ready. As the sun set on the eve of the full moon, the village was gripped by an uneasy stillness. The people went about their evening routines, lighting torches and lanterns, their faces tight with worry. They all knew what was coming. The shadows had grown stronger each night, and with the full moon rising, they feared the darkness might finally consume them all. But Aric, standing at the center of the village square, was filled not with fear, but with determination. He had discovered the secret of the shadows, the balance between light and darkness, and he was ready to act. The village did not need more light, but less, a softer, gentler glow that would allow the shadows to return to their rightful place. He had seen it in the forge, had felt it in the flicker of the flame that cast shadows without fear. Now He had to convince the village to trust in that balance. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Aric gathered the villagers together. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear, but they listened to him. After all, it was he who had calmed the shadows before. "We've been wrong," Aric began, his voice clear and steady. "The more we try to banish the shadows, the stronger they become. We've used too much light, and we've upset the balance. The shadows are born from that imbalance. If we want to stop them, we have to restore the harmony between light and dark." The villagers murmured among themselves, unsure. Some shook their heads, their fear too great, but others, those who had seen what Aric had done the night before, listened with growing hope. "What are you saying?" one of the elders asked, stepping forward. "That we should let the darkness in? That we should do nothing?" "No," Aric replied. "We don't have to let the darkness take over, but we can't keep fighting it with blinding light. The shadows need a place to rest, just as we do. We need to use softer light, candles, lanterns, and stop trying to chase every shadow away." A long silence followed his words, broken only by the crackling of torches in the square. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether they could trust such an idea. After all, they had spent nights battling the shadows, believing that more light would keep them safe. But now, that light had only seemed to stir the darkness further. "Trust me," Aric pleaded. "I've seen it with my own eyes. We have to let the shadows return to their natural place. If we do, they'll calm, and the village will be safe." One by one, the villagers began to nod. Their trust in Aric, though fragile, was enough to make them act. Slowly, they began extinguishing the tall blazing torches that lined the streets, leaving only the soft, warm glow of lanterns and candles. The village dimmed, bathed in a gentle, flickering light. Shadows appeared, but they were no longer wild and untamed. Instead, they nestled into corners and along the edges of buildings, their movements slow and peaceful, as though they had finally found rest. Aric felt a surge of hope. It was working. The balance was returning. But as the full moon rose high into the sky, casting its pale light over the village, the shadows stirred once more. This time, they did not slink along the ground or dance in the streets. They rose, tall and dark, stretching upward like great pillars of night. The villagers gasped in fear, backing away from the towering shapes. Aric's heart pounded in his chest. He had restored the balance in the village's light, but the shadows were still tied to the moon, still drawn to its cold, unyielding glow. The moon's light was not soft. It was sharp, casting deep shadows that grew stronger with every passing second. He realized then what the witch had meant. The moon's light was blind. Aric knew what he had to do. He ran to the center of the village square, where an old, tall candle stood atop the fountain, casting a soft glow. Without hesitation, he reached up and grabbed the candle, holding it high above his head. The villagers watched in stunned silence as Aric climbed the steps of the fountain and faced the towering shadows. "Come!" he shouted into the night, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "Find your place in the light!" For a moment, nothing happened. The shadows stood tall, their forms wavering in the moonlight, dark and menacing. But then slowly, they began to shift. Drawn by the soft glow of Aric's candle, the shadows shrank, folding in on themselves as they retreated from the harsh moonlight. They drifted toward the gentle flame, slipping into their natural places, along the edges of the square, into the crevices between houses, where they no longer threatened or moved with malice. The balance had been restored. The villagers held their breath, watching in awe as the once fearsome shadow settled into peaceful silence. The night was calm, the air still, and for the first time in many days, the village felt safe again. Aric climbed down from the fountain, his candle still burning bright. The villagers surrounded him, their eyes filled with gratitude and wonder. "You did it," one of them whispered. "You found the secret." Aric smiled, though his heart was still heavy. The night was not over, and the full moon would rise again. But for now, the village was safe, and the balance, fragile though it may be, had been restored. He knew there was still one more challenge to face. The shadows had been calmed, but the witch's spell still hung over the village, and only by confronting her once more could he lift it for good. But that would come later. For now, the village slept in peace, and the shadows danced no more. The night after the full moon had passed, the village was calm, but Aric knew it was not over. The shadows, though pacified for now, were still under the witch's spell. The balance he had restored was temporary. Unless he confronted the witch once more and lifted the curse entirely, the shadows would rise again. There was no time to waste. At dawn, Aric left the village, slipping into the forest once more. The trees, tall and silent, whispered in the wind, their branches casting long shadows over the path. But now, Aric was no longer afraid. He had seen the power of the shadows, understood their nature, and more importantly, he had learned how to tame them. As he ventured deeper into the woods, Aric's thoughts raced. He knew that the witch had been watching him. She had given him clues, riddles wrapped in mystery. But there was something she had not yet revealed, something important. Her spell had bound the shadows to the village, and only she had the power to break it. Soon, the strange light of the clearing appeared once again, shimmering through the trees like a beacon. The air grew colder as Aric approached, and there, in the center of the clearing, the witch stood waiting for him. Her long dark robes flowed like the shadows themselves, and her eyes glimmered with the same eerie light that filled the clearing. "You've come," the witch said, her voice as soft and cold as the breeze that stirred the leaves. "I wondered when you would return." Aric stepped forward, his heart steady. He had no time for riddles, no patience for games. "The village is safe for now," he said, "but the shadows are still under your spell. I need you to break it." The witch raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in her expression. "And why would I do that?" "Because the balance has been restored," Aric replied, his voice firm. "I understand now. Light and shadow are meant to coexist, not to fight one another. The shadows don't need to be destroyed. They just need a place in the world." The witch's smile faded, and her eyes darkened. "You think you understand balance, boy?" she asked, her tone sharp. "You think a few candles and soft lights will undo centuries of arrogance, of the village's refusal to see the value of darkness?" Aric's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice calm. "I know the village made mistakes. They feared the shadows and tried to chase them away with too much light. But I also know that the answer isn't in letting the shadows run wild. We've found balance, and now it's time to lift the curse." The witch's gaze bore into him, and for a long moment she was silent. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she stepped toward the altar in the center of the clearing, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols carved into the stone. "There is more to this curse than you realize," she said, her voice softer now, almost sad. "I cast the spell not to harm the village, but to teach it a lesson. Shadows have been part of this world since the dawn of time, but your people, like so many others, forgot that darkness has its place. They blinded themselves with too much light, and in doing so, they lost their connection to the natural order." Aric watched her closely, sensing that beneath her cold words lay a deeper pain, a wound that had festered for years. "But I've learned that lesson," he said quietly, "and so has the village. We won't forget the importance of balance again. Please, lift the curse." The witch turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Aric saw something in her eyes that wasn't anger or disdain, something softer, more human. "I will lift the curse," she said at last. "But remember this, balance is fragile. It can be restored, but it can also be broken again, with a single act of blindness or greed. The village must always remember the lesson you've learned, or the shadows will rise again." Aric nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He knew the task was not just to save the village, but to ensure that it remained in harmony, that the balance between light and dark was never again disturbed. The witch raised her hands, and the air around them shimmered with magic. A soft wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the whispers of ancient spells. Aric felt the power of the curse lift, as though a great weight had been removed from the world. The shadows, once wild and dangerous, would now return to their natural state. "It is done," the witch said, lowering her hands. "The shadows will no longer trouble your village. But remember, boy, the power of the shadows is always there, waiting. It is up to you to keep the balance." Aric bowed his head, grateful yet humbled. "Thank you," he said quietly. Without another word, the witch turned and vanished into the forest, her dark form melting into the shadows. Aric stood alone in the clearing, the weight of her final words heavy in his heart. As he made his way back to the village, the trees seemed less menacing, the shadows less threatening. The balance had been restored, and for the first time in many nights, the village would sleep peacefully. But Aric knew the truth. Balance was a delicate thing, and it was up to him and the villagers to protect it. The shadows, like the light, had their place in the world, and as long as they remembered that, the village would remain safe. For now, the shadows had returned to their rightful places, and the boy who had once feared the dark had become its keeper. The village awoke to a morning bathed in the soft light of dawn, the air crisp and filled with the promise of a new beginning. The shadows, once wild and fearsome, now lay quietly in their natural places, nestled beneath trees, along the edges of buildings, and underfoot where they belonged. The villagers, who had spent nights trembling in fear, emerged from their homes cautiously at first, their faces drawn with weariness. But as the sun climbed higher and the shadows remained calm, their fears began to melt away. Aric stood at the edge of the village square, watching as life slowly returned to normal. He had spent much of the night thinking about the witch's final words, about how delicate the balance between light and shadow truly was. The curse had been lifted, but it was up to the villagers to keep the lesson alive in their hearts. Too much light, and the shadows would rebel again. Too much darkness, and the village would fall into despair. It was a balance that had to be tended carefully, like the embers of a fire. As the day stretched on, the villagers began to approach Aric with words of thanks and admiration. The elders, who had once dismissed him as just a boy, now regarded him with newfound respect. The baker handed him a warm loaf of bread. The blacksmith, now returned to his forge, clapped him on the back, and his parents embraced him tightly, their eyes filled with pride. But even as the village rejoiced, Aric could not forget the weight of the responsibility that still lingered over him. He had discovered the secret of the shadows, had restored the balance, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The villagers were grateful, yes, but gratitude could fade, and memories of fear could be easily forgotten. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the village gathered around the square to celebrate their newfound peace, Aric stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, watching the flickering lanterns and the soft glow of candles. The light was gentle, not overpowering, and the shadows moved slowly and naturally, no longer twisted by the weight of fear or excess light. Suddenly, a voice broke through his thoughts. His grandmother's voice, warm and familiar. She stood beside him, her wise eyes fixed on the village. "You've done well, Aric," she said softly. "The village is safe because of you." Aric smiled, though it was tinged with a trace of weariness. "It's not just me, grandmother. The village learned too. They understand now about the balance." His grandmother nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Yes, but understanding is only the first step. Keeping that balance is another thing entirely. You've given the village a great gift, but it is a fragile one. The shadows will always be there, waiting at the edges of the light." Aric knew she was right. The witch had warned him, and now his grandmother was reminding him. The balance could be broken again if they were not careful. "Do you think the village will remember?" Aric asked quietly. His grandmother looked at him, her smile gentle. "They will, because you will remind them. You have become the keeper of that balance, Aric. It is your gift and your responsibility." The words settled over him like a mantle, and Aric felt the truth of them. He had been the one to discover the secret of the shadows, to face the witch, and to restore the harmony between light and dark. It was a heavy burden, but one he would carry willingly. He had seen what could happen when that balance was lost, and he would not let it happen again. As the night deepened and the celebration continued, Aric walked through the village, the soft glow of candles lighting his way. The shadows followed him, but this time they did not move with menace. They were part of the village, just as the light was, and he knew now that they always would be. The witch's warning echoed in his mind, but so did her promise. The shadows would rise again only if the balance was disturbed. And as long as Aric remained vigilant, as long as the village remembered the lesson they had learned, the shadows would stay in their place. The next morning, as the village woke once more to the soft light of a peaceful dawn, Aric stood at the edge of the forest, gazing out over the trees. The witch had vanished into the shadows, her work done, but he felt her presence still, watching from the depths of the forest, waiting to see if the village would hold true to its promise. Aric turned back to the village, his heart filled with quiet determination. The shadows, once feared and misunderstood, were now part of the village's story, part of its future. And as long as the village kept the balance, light and shadow would dance together, just as they were meant to. And so, the village lived on, restored and at peace, under the watchful eye of the boy who had become the keeper of the shadows. The boy who had learned that light and darkness were not enemies, but two sides of the same coin, forever intertwined in the dance of life.